see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here today with Stan Davis, and we're here to talk about how we can build a culture of empathy in the education system. And I met Stan through the Ashoka Changemakers website. Both he and I are expert, quote, expert commentators on the competition that they're having about best practices for developing empathy in the schools. And Stan, could you perhaps introduce yourself a bit? Just say a little bit something about who you are and your interest in empathy.
Sure. Well, I spent 40 years working as a child and family therapist, the first half, the first 20, and then as a school counselor, the second half. So this has been a real important issue to me all along the way, because you meet kids who don't have the components of empathy, and the question is how we can develop that. And then we see kids who are strongly empathic, and those two groups of kids are on a very different path. So I've been very interested throughout in how we can nurture that part of children.
So from your website, I see that you're working with bullying. Is that kind of been one of your major projects?
Yeah, my focus for a long time has been what we do to reduce mean behavior, including bullying. I think in some ways bullying is too restrictive a word, because we think of that as meaning intentionally hurtful behavior, where there's certainly people who do carelessly hurtful behavior too. So reducing the frequency of these actions that are likely to hurt, but then also working to support resiliency with kids who are called names or who are excluded, because we're never going to reduce mean behavior to nothing. So we also have to look at what we can do to help kids be harder to hurt.
So I'm looking here, you have, is that your project, the Welcome to the Youth Voice Project? I have that up here on the web page. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that, what that's
about.
Sure.
Well, I've been real interested in the kinds of advice that kids are given when they're mistreated by other people. And there's been this whole succession of traditional sets of advice been given to kids for a long, long time, ranging from tell them to cut it out, or punch them in the face, or just pretend it doesn't bother you, or just walk away, or on and on and on. And advice is also given to peers who witness mean behavior and are concerned about it, as most of them are. And the question was, how well do these things actually work in real life? So Sharice Nixon at Penn State and I worked with a group of kids to construct a longish questionnaire, which we then administered online to more than 13,000 kids. And out of those 13,000, there were almost 3,000 who said they'd been mistreated on a fairly regular basis. We focused on those kids and asked them, which of these things have you yourself tried doing? And did things get better or worse, or was there's no change when you did that? Which of these things did adults do, and what were the outcomes? And which of these things did peers do, and what were the outcomes? And we are still putting together the data, but there's some very clear directions coming from it, which is that a lot of the traditional advice kids said had not been that helpful to them. Only about a fifth of kids who had told someone to stop said things got better afterwards, where more kids said if they told an adult, or if they got support from a peer, or as kids got older, even more, this one, if they reminded themselves that the mean behavior was about some characteristic of the person who was being mean to them, and rather than being their own fault, that things were a bit more likely to get better. And we also looked at actions by adults and peers where things were likely to get better. And the main actions were actions of support and inclusion. So the difficulty has been that peers who are concerned about mean behavior have been told in many places, you should stand up against it, you should tell the person to stop, you should, even we sometimes use the word confront in curriculum.
Yeah.
And kids won't do that because they're afraid of getting hurt. And so they're in that bind where they're having compassion or empathy, and yet they're not doing anything. And what we see is empathy for the target of the misbehavior reduces over time if kids can't figure out something to do, because they don't want to feel bad. So what they do is to tell themselves, oh, they deserve it, or there's nothing you can do about it anyway. So finding effective action for the 85% of kids who are in any school who really want things to stop is a very important thing. And what we found, what the kids who were mistreated told us, to me, is the key, that they wanted friendship, inclusion, emotional support, encouragement. And they said even if that meant a call away from school at home, the safest thing that another kid could do, that was more likely to help than if that other kid confronted the kid in the hallway. So that to me is very exciting, because it means we can sustain the level of empathy and concern that younger kids have for their peers who are mistreated by helping them find effective and positive and safe things to do to help. And then they can sustain that level of empathy and concern as they grow older instead of losing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I see that you're talking about kind of a bullying situation, and I see, the bullying kind of takes place in a larger social context. And if we look at, what kind of goes on in the Congress, we see kind of almost like, in the media, we see kind of bullying behavior kind of manifest, and children are watching that, and it's influencing the overall society, in terms of what the societal values are. And kind of what I'm looking at is how do we kind of change the society, at a larger level, to say empathy is a social value. We need a culture that nurtures, fosters empathy, in all areas. And then we bring it down to, okay, here we have these situations, these, nuts and bolts, or, real world situations where, children are being bullied, and how do we, change that situation to develop greater empathy, to transform that situation from being domination, or, whatever the dynamics are, to being that empathy is nurtured, and that, or an empathic outcome comes from that. So from what you were saying, what are you saying is the best way then to create like an empathic transformation? Because I hear, for example, that with the bully, it's like to the bully you say, don't do that, and it's like all that does is kind of like reinforce kind of this power dynamic, with the bully. And I hear, ideas like, well, engage in a dialogue about what's going on with the bully, or so what?
A couple of things. First of all, I really would like to see us stop using the noun bully, because we really, there's no one meaning to that word. Kids are mean to other kids for a whole variety of reasons, including, as you said, that they're imitating what Rush Limbaugh said about Sandra Fluck, or they're imitating behavior that they see on the Jersey Shore, or they're imitating what they see going on in campaigns, or they're imitating what they see in their own families or their own communities. And those kids don't necessarily have any kind of character flaw. They're doing what children have always done, which is to imitate adult behavior. We still have to work with them about it. But there's no word that would include that kid, and then also the second category of kids who have some kind of impairment. Either they're very impulsive, or they truly don't get the emotions of others. They truly don't have the cognitive part of empathy, which is to say they really don't know that someone else is bothered by what they're doing, or they just don't know how else to deal with a situation. Like, for example, they're out in a game, or they want to have a little more power in a situation. They only know that one way, which is to attack verbally or physically. And so you have a group of kids who are kind of socialized into mean behavior, and that's by far the largest, I think. You have a group of kids who have empathy, who have deficits in some kind of skill, and then you have a very, very vanishingly tiny group of kids who consciously target the situations and people who they can do the most harm for. Some fraction of a percent of people who fit the kind of stereotype of the bully, which is someone who very calculatingly uses their cognitive, intellectual knowledge of what someone else is feeling to do the thing that hurts the most. So there really is not a good umbrella word. Well, I think the question is, if somebody is mean to someone else, what do we do about it? And that's different in those three groups. In the largest group, which is the kids who are responding to social modeling, we can do media education and help them see what models they're being given. A very simple example, but I think brilliant, in a middle school, their health teacher had a discussion with all the kids and said, please make a list of all the TV shows you really enjoy watching. Second, now think about the values you want to live by in life and the way in which you'd like to live your life, the direction you want your life to go in, and write a little bit about that. And third, put a plus next to the shows that exemplify those values that you want to live by and those directions you want your life to go. And a minus next to those shows which show the opposite. And this is a lovely discovery activity. What happened was almost all the kids found many more minuses than pluses, and a bunch of the kids found no pluses on their list. And I was talking to this teacher. She said it really shook them up. It really bothered them that that was true. And now because they'd done that reflection, now they were in a position to think about how they're going to choose what they watch or how they're going to respond to what they watch in a more conscious way. The second piece is to do information gathering with the kids at large. One of the questions that I'll ask schools in surveys, ask the students is, which of the, for this whole list of negative behaviors, name calling about disability, cutting someone in line, to take two examples at the two ends of the spectrum, hitting, pushing, threatening, and name calling about how much income another family has, and a list of other things. Do you want adults to get involved in this? Which I think is a pretty good proxy for, do you want them to stop? And we find at most schools, at the top of a list, as defined by the kids, 90% of kids say, I want adults to get involved. Then we get way down to the bottom, cutting in line or choosing not to be someone's friend, and 20-30% will say, I want adults to get involved. What we do is take the items at the top of the list, which almost always includes name calling about disability, name calling about sexual orientation, often includes the indirect use of biased language, like saying this is so gay. And when 75, 80, 85, 90% of kids are saying they want something to stop, that's very powerful corrective information to feed back to the students. Because what we found in all kinds of efforts to do what's called social norms marketing, that people often underestimate the number of their peers who are against a certain behavior. So they hear hate speech all the time. And so they assume everyone else is okay with it. But seeing that 80% of their peers want it to stop will directly influence the behavior of this group who are influenced by media and influenced by their perception of norms. And then the third thing that works with this group sometimes is very small consequences, even on a level of a letter home saying the next time your child will have a lunch away from the other kids. There's no need for anything large with these kids. What they need to know is that there's a boundary in every part of the school that is going to discourage or try to reduce a class of behaviors, and that it's not just that one teacher's uncomfortable with it or one kid's uncomfortable with it, but there's been a consensus development through input from students, as I talked about, and through discussion by staff that says, you know, these behaviors really don't advance the school's mission of promoting education for everyone. And so we're going to discourage them with all our heart. When that happens, what I've seen is within a fairly short time, this group of kids gets it together and you see a reduction in these levels of behavior, sometimes pretty dramatic. Because these are kids who already have the core elements of empathy. It's that they've been distracted by them, by all this modeling and their incorrect sense of the norms. The second group, the kids who are truly lacking in some kind of skill, whether it's impulse control or delay of gratification or a cognitive understanding or an emotional understanding of what others feel, the two halves of empathy as I see it, those kids need some more work. And you do all the things you do for the first group, but there's often also a need for the school counselor to spend some time with those kids and really help them process their actions and think about what they did and what impact that action had on someone else, how they know that, what they saw, what they heard, and then what else they could do when they want whatever they wanted when they did this. Did they want to express frustration because they were out in a game? Did they want to be heard? Did they want someone else to admire them or laugh at them? These are very common motivations. Were they troubled about something else in their lives? And if so, then there's a need to practice different responses to that trigger so that they can shift. And you do all the other things, including small consequences. And then for that third group, which has, as I understand it, that third group has the cognitive elements of empathy very strongly. In other words, that tiny, tiny group of kids who really set out to do harm to others. Those kids often have superb social skills understanding. In other words, they can look at someone and say, what form of name calling will cause this person the most pain? Dan Olveus, one of the pioneers in bullying prevention, pointed this out to me, that for this group there's often a split kind of empathy, that they have the ability to cognitively, intellectually analyze the feelings of other people, but they don't feel those feelings or find them important. So it's as though they're studying under a microscope and they say, oh yeah, if I poke right here, that person will feel intense pain. But when they poke, they don't feel any shadow or echo pain themselves. So it's possible for that very tiny group of people to do severe harm in a very conscious way. And as I see the research, getting those kids to feel with others and to feel the feelings of others can be a pretty long-term project. For some of those kids, there's a biological or brain injury element. For some of those kids, there's a fetal alcohol exposure element. For some of those kids, there's a severe trauma element. And for some kids, we just don't know. Those kids, the first job is to keep them from hurting other people while we try to help them change. And then to continue to try to help them change. Because if those kids don't change, they're going to go on through life causing harm to other people. So we try that, but I don't think we have high expectations that we're going to change those people in the short run. And so we really have to do harm reduction as well. So that's, as I said, that's the difficulty I have with the word bullying, is it really kind of, in a sense, is umbrellas over all those three groups. And what those three groups need to make them empathic, functional, kind human beings are really, to a certain extent, quite different.
So it's really the bullying just creates this umbrella, and everybody gets kind of thrown in there. And what we really need to do is start getting to the nuances, to really differentiate and really get specific about what it is that's going on and what the remedies are, or the way to deal with each one individually and most effectively.
Yeah, and I think the best parallel I know here is drinking and driving. We have a strong social interest in reducing drinking and driving because of the potential for harm that comes from it. Now, that potential for harm has almost nothing to do with the person's intention, or whether they're an alcoholic, or whether they're even one of these tiny group of sociopaths. We first of all have to have the same standard for everyone, which is you're not supposed to drink and drive. And we have to approach everyone the same way the first time, which is a little penalty, some education. Then people who are habitually doing this, we need to look at whether there's an element of addiction or skill, or whether there's an actual will to hurt. Again, that's very rare. And those two groups need somewhat different interventions. So I found that a very useful parallel, because there isn't a word for someone who drinks and drives. And it's true because it's such a diverse group of people, and we really have to think about which category a person is showing us they're in, which our hypothesis is, before we know what to do. But still, we can approach them all the same way the first time. We can say, we do a traffic stop, we can do a small consequence, and then we watch and see what happens. And it might surprise us. That might be the last time they do it. That's terrific. It might be 10, 12, 20 times, and now we have to think, okay, no, we need more than this.
Well, you were saying that bullying isn't a good umbrella term, and then you used meanness. And kind of maybe differentiating meanness. It's my
word. The word that I like best is potentially harmful behavior from peers to peers, because we know that some things are likely to harm other people, and we can actually pretty much agree on those things often. Which things? It's kind of the reasonable person test. Mm-hmm. Things that we have potential to harm. Mm-hmm. I like that much better, because it doesn't imply intent, and it doesn't imply that someone's been harmed. It's a decision that says, if you make fun of a person, if you mistreat someone based on who they are or what they are, that behavior is likely to do harm. And that's a place to start.
Mm-hmm. So see it as harmful behavior. So there's this spectrum spectrum of harmful behaviors.
Yeah, and again, I would say potentially harmful because
Oh, potentially harmful.
we shouldn't have to prove harm to do something. We wouldn't with drinking and driving say, oh well, no one was hurt, so go on, drive home. Because we say doing this increases your likelihood of hurting someone else, therefore we want to discourage that action. And I think that's a way to build empathy too, is we don't just say if someone's been hurt. That's a kind of very young child level thinking about empathy. We want to move on to a more cognitively advanced level of empathy that says this action is likely to hurt, even if it didn't hurt someone this time. And that takes some work, but certainly kids can get there when you start asking that question.
Well, the way I'm approaching it is saying that we need, I'm just creating a term like culture of empathy, that we need to create kind of this positive vision out there. Like this is the vision that we want to aspire to. And a culture of empathy is, empathy is not like on and off. It's really a scale. It's like the light dimmer, right? We can be kind of low on it. We can upgrade it, and we're never 100%, but we can do the best we can to raise that level. So part is to have the intention that we want to raise the level of empathy within society. And how can we do that? And what is the vision? What will that look like? What will human interactions look like if we're in an empathy-rich environment?
Well, as I see it, the idea is that we should do what Gandhi had in mind. I got to visit the ashram where he developed his work in India a few months back, and I was kind of soaking that in. And I realized that we've really misunderstood in the West the word nonviolence. When you hear people talking at Martin Luther King Day, for example, or about his birthday, little kids, often what they're saying is, he didn't hit. And that's not at all what Gandhi had in mind. That's not enough. The two words that defined nonviolence in Hindi, were two words that Gandhi used most, were satyagraha, which means the force of truth, and ahimsa, which means universal love. So if you think of us having an obligation to say the truth in a loving way, then that's a really lovely definition of where we could go with this, so that I am concerned for what's best for me, I'm also concerned for what's best for you. And I take the time to try and figure out what those two things are and to blend them. It's an old Christian saying, and Jewish saying too, that when the Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself, it doesn't say more than yourself, it doesn't say less than yourself, it says as yourself. So if our concern for others and our concern for ourselves are blended, that's the vision. And we certainly see flashes of that in this world. And I think of the advertisers who dropped Rush Limbaugh after his sexist insults, several of them said, I thought of my own daughters, and I realized that they might be treated like this someday, and so I couldn't support this behavior. And that's a very empathic statement. It's putting yourself outside yourself and not saying, I realized I would lose customers, but putting yourself into someone else's heart and thinking, well, how does this experienced by them? And so this is what I see, and this is what I've seen develop in schools when you keep asking those questions. When someone's face looks like this, what is that telling you for the youngest kids? How does someone feel when you do this or that or that? How can you tell? So the beginning, as outlined in the second step program and Myrna Shore's work and a number of other people, the beginning is to teach kids to decode visual clues to others' feelings. The second step program does a brilliant job of this. You hold up pictures of faces showing different feelings, and kids have to decode those and then think about them. And you can certainly do that in literature, and you can do it with movies, and you can do it in real life. So that first, the only question is, what is this? What do I think this person's thinking? And second, is there a link between what I did and what that person thinks? And then over time, you want to ripen that into not being just cognitive, but also emotive, so that I feel an echo of what the other person's feeling. And once you're there, then it's much harder to be mean to somebody else, because you feel their hurt almost as if it was your own. These are things that can very much be cultivated. And then Also, we have to honor people meeting their own needs. So the question is, if I want or need something, how do I do that in a way that also advances things for other people? So a wonderful example of this is the Urey and Fisher book, Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In, which is very well established and been around for a long time, looking at how we deal with conflict so that the outcome, as much as possible, meets both people's needs and sustains the relationship. And I think those principles, as we ripple them out, make a big difference.
Yeah, so I think what you're addressing is that term often used as common humanity, where I see the humanity, what's going on for you, and I see it for myself. And it's also, for me, it's like encouraging. It's not just like, well, here I'm going to be in the world, I'm going to see everyone's humanity. It's also saying, hey, this needs to be a cultural value, folks. We need to make this a conscious cultural value within society that we need to foster seeing each other's humanity. And there's just a study out from UC Berkeley where they were kind of studying greed. And it was basically, if you kind of create an environment where greed is good, is like people say, okay, this is the rules of the game. The rules of the game is greed is good. So I am going to follow the social norms of greed is good, and and stop seeing people's humanity. So it's kind of like we got to say, no, greed is not good. Seeing people's common humanity is really what we're about. It's gonna, and so anyway, that's kind of what's coming to me around that. And
absolutely, Melvin Lerner in the 70s did some work on what he called the just world theory, with the idea that many people, when they observe misfortune, blame the person who has the misfortune for what's happened to them. And the results of the study are very interesting. They show somebody being yelled at through a one-way mirror, being yelled at by their boss. And the people on the other end of the mirror, the other side of the mirror, are actors, but the experimental subjects on this side watching don't know that. And then they ask them to describe the person who was yelled at before being yelled at and after being yelled at. And they found that many, many people would then describe the person who was yelled at in more negative terms, as if to make the equation come out. In other words, that person was yelled at, therefore they must have been doing a bad job. And this carries over to when people pass a homeless person on the street asking for money and they choose not to give money. Many people in these studies then start creating a fantasy history for that person in which they don't have a job because they drank or they didn't show up on time. In some way, if people can make the equation come out so that the misfortune is the person's own fault, then that justifies not helping, and then the person who's having these thoughts feels better. The exciting thing about Lerner's work is, and this isn't always reported on when people talk about the just world theory, was that when the experimenters told people, you are not to blame the person on the other side of the mirror for what's being done to them, because that's not necessarily their fault, whether the person is being presented as a rape victim or a person being yelled at by their supervisor or something else. When people were explicitly instructed, you shouldn't blame people for their misfortunes unless you really know they made them happen, then it changed the outcome of the experiment. And so sometimes just very explicit statements from people who are trusted or in authority saying, for example, let's not blame people in poverty for where they are. There are a lot of other things going on as well, like their jobs going overseas to Sri Lanka or the Philippines. And so that can have very positive outcomes. I think of another example is there's been a lot of talk about those people on food stamps and how they are sponging off the rest of us and in this political season. And one of the news programs did this very short video clip interview with a single father that just stuck in my mind and my heart. It was a wonderful example of what we can do. They showed this guy with his two kids who are maybe 6 and 10, and he's alone with them, and his landscaping business isn't doing so well, and so there isn't as much money. And he talked about how the efforts he's making to try and make more money. And then they said, well, you're on food stamps, so how does that work out? He said, well, they last for most of the month, but the last week I don't eat much, or sometimes not anything at all. And that was such a connection, because I can imagine doing that with my own kids. And they said, how does that work out for you? And he said, it's pretty good, except my oldest son has started noticing that I'm not eating, and I think it bothers him. And so that's the problem. And so it was just, first of all, a lovely example of empathy, but an example of the kinds of things that trigger empathy for us, which is seeing someone who we can identify with and seeing the struggle the person's going through. So that kind of storytelling, accurate, honest storytelling, is, I think, one of the ways we can promote this kind of positive culture is to say, well, let's stop talking about people in poverty in abstract only. Let's talk about them as human beings. And then we see, I could be there, or I could use that solution, or I admire what that man's done. I've known other people who will, at dinner toward the end of a month, will say, Mom ate at work. And then we'll put on a positive, cheerful front so as not to bother the kids. And knowing that people do that changes how we feel about poverty, this whole big thing. And that's an example, I think, of what you're talking about.
Yeah, not just judging, but just seeing what's going on for the people for others at a deeper level. You brought up nonviolence and Gandhi, and I hear, especially around the Occupy movement, there's a lot of dialogue about nonviolence. And I've always kind of been uncomfortable with the word, because a lot of the ways that it's used is almost like, it's like supporting the existing paradigm that we're selfish, greedy human beings in competition, and that being violent in that fight is not as effective as being nonviolent. Have that fight, but do it in a nonviolent way, which is really kind of supporting the existing paradigm instead of seeing our common humanity and and fostering empathy to create connection. So, it's like, it's for protesters to be seeing the humanity of the police, for the police to see the humanity of the protesters, for the city officials to see the humanity of the protesters, and all the way around. So,
and that was the way that King and the other nonviolent pioneers in the United States used the word, was that you had to see the humanity in the police. And certainly what Gandhi said. Gandhi said to the Prime Minister of England, I'm doing this because I know it would be better for England to let us go as a colony, not just because it's better for us. And he maintained that approach throughout. So, no, I agree with you completely. Well, I just, the person I'm going to talk to at 1:30 just popped up.
Okay, so thanks so much,
we're kind
Stan.
of on short time.
Yeah.
Is this okay for now?
Yeah, this is great, and we can do a panel in the future too, and other dialogues. So look forward to talking to you, and thanks for taking the time for sharing.
Sure, and
this.
Edwin, you might want to look up the Gandhi King Institute online. There is an internet connection of folks working to portray the true Gandhi message. And there's some very interesting dialogues on that, so they'd be worth checking out.
Okay, thanks, Stan.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Thanks.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.